Some stories don't start with a tragedy. They start with a Tuesday. A regular, unremarkable Tuesday in Austin, Texas, where the sun hits the pavement hard, the traffic on I-35 never really stops, and somewhere in a modest two-bedroom house on the east side of the city, a father is sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for his son to come home. His name is Robert. Today's story is going to be very interesting and full of lessons. If you are new to our channel, make sure to subscribe and don't forget to share your thoughts after listening to the story. Robert isn't the kind of man you'd write a movie about. Not at first glance, anyway. He's 51 years old, a little gray at the temples, with hands that have spent 20 years moving boxes, managing shipments, and keeping a warehouse running on time. He makes about $4,500 a month. Not rich. Not struggling in the way that keeps you up at night, but close enough to careful that he never really relaxes. He knows exactly what's in his bank account at any given moment. He knows which bills come out on the 1st and which come out on the 15th. He knows the difference between a want and a need the way some people know the difference between breathing and not breathing. Robert learned those lessons the hard way. He grew up without much. His father left when he was 9. His mother worked 2 jobs and still sometimes had to choose between the electric bill and the grocery run. Robert remembered the shame of that. The specific kind of shame that comes when you're a kid and you can't explain to your friends why your lights went out again. He swore quietly, privately, the way young boys make promises to themselves. He swore he would never let that happen to his own family. And he didn't. He built something small but stable. A house. A steady job. A life that wasn't glamorous but was his. And in the middle of that life, there was Ethan. Ethan was 18 when the story really begins. Tall, bright-eyed, the kind of kid who makes you laugh without trying. He had graduated high school that spring, not at the top of his class, but not at the bottom either. Somewhere in the comfortable middle, where a lot of kids live, where nobody's too worried about you but nobody's too impressed either. He had enrolled in community college, declared a general studies major because he wasn't sure what he wanted yet, and moved back into his old bedroom with the broken desk chair and the faded posters on the wall. And for a little while, things were fine. Robert paid for everything. The groceries. The utilities. The Wi-Fi that Ethan used to stream videos until 2 in the morning. The gas in the car Ethan borrowed 3 or 4 times a week. Robert didn't complain. He was happy to have his son home. He was happy to watch him eat breakfast at the kitchen table again, happy to hear footsteps in the hallway at night. After years of it just being him in that house, the noise felt good. But something was nagging at Robert. He watched Ethan. Not in a suspicious way, in the way fathers watch their children when they're trying to understand something they can't quite name. He watched Ethan sleep until noon. He watched him scroll through his phone for hours. He watched him come home from college one afternoon, drop his backpack at the door, and turn on the TV without saying a word about his classes. Robert asked about school. Ethan gave short answers. Fine. It's okay. Yeah, I went. And then one evening in October, Ethan sat down across from Robert at the kitchen table and said, quietly and without much emotion, that he had withdrawn from his classes. He wasn't going back. College wasn't for him. He didn't know what he wanted to do instead, he just knew it wasn't that. Robert didn't yell. That surprised Ethan, who had come to the table braced for a fight, rehearsed in his head, ready to defend himself. But Robert just nodded slowly, looked down at his coffee cup and said, okay. Just that. But the next morning, Robert came to Ethan's room and asked him to sit down because they needed to have a conversation. And that conversation changed everything. Robert told Ethan he loved him. He said it first, clearly, because he wanted that to be the foundation of everything that came after. He said, I love you, and because I love you, I'm going to be honest with you in a way that might feel uncomfortable. He told Ethan about growing up without his father. About watching his mother stretch every dollar until it nearly snapped. About the warehouse job he'd taken at 23 because it was the only thing hiring, and how he was still there almost 30 years later, not because he failed, but because he hadn't built anything of his own when he had the chance. He wasn't bitter about it, but he was clear-eyed about what it had cost him. He said, I don't want that for you. And then he slid a piece of paper across the table. On it were 3 numbers, $250 for utilities. $250 for groceries, $100 for household expenses, $600 a month. He told Ethan that as long as he was living in this house without being in school, he needed to contribute. Not because Robert needed the money, the house was paid off and he managed fine on his salary, but because Ethan needed to learn what things cost. He needed to feel the weight of a dollar. He needed to understand that comfort isn't free, that someone somewhere is always paying for it, and that the sooner he understood that, the better his life would be. Ethan stared at the paper for a long time. Then he looked up at his father and said, "My friends don't pay rent at home." Robert nodded. "I know. Their parents don't charge them anything. I know that too. So why are you doing this to me?" Robert looked at his son for a moment before answering. Not with anger. Not with defensiveness. Just with the steady, tired patience of a man who has thought about this question for a long time. He said, "Because I'm not trying to be your friend. I'm trying to be your father." Ethan didn't speak to him much for the next 3 days. He texted his friends. He complained. He vented to his cousin Marcus, who told him that was messed up, that Robert was being harsh, that he should just find somewhere else to stay. For a few nights, Ethan actually looked up rooms for rent on Craigslist. A $600 room in a house with 3 strangers, utilities not included, 20 minutes away with no car. And slowly, quietly, the math started to land. $600 at home versus everything it would actually cost to leave. He did the numbers, even though he hated himself a little for doing them, because doing them felt like admitting his father was right. But the numbers didn't lie. Staying was still the better deal. So Ethan stayed. He picked up a part-time job at a shipping company, not glamorous, not what he imagined for himself, and every first of the month, he slid an envelope under his father's bedroom door. He did it with resentment. He did it without saying good morning. But he did it. And Robert, alone in his room on those mornings, opened each envelope, counted the bills, and did something Ethan wouldn't find out about for years. He didn't spend a single dollar of it. There is a specific kind of loneliness that lives inside a house where 2 people love each other but can't find the words to say it. That was Robert and Ethan's house for the better part of 2 years. They coexisted. They passed each other in the hallway. They ate dinner at the same table sometimes, but rarely at the same time. Ethan would come home from work, heat something up, eat standing at the counter, and disappear back into his room. Robert would sit at the kitchen table with his coffee and the news on low, the way a man sits when he's used to silence but hasn't quite made peace with it. They weren't fighting. That would have at least required engagement. This was something quieter and in some ways harder. 2 people who had decided, without saying so out loud, to simply wait each other out. Ethan had built a wall. And he maintained it with the specific discipline of someone who believes they've been wronged. He was working now, full-time, eventually at the shipping company where he'd started part-time. He was loading trucks, scanning inventory, doing the kind of physical work that leaves you tired in your bones by Thursday. It wasn't what he'd imagined his life looking like at 19. His friends from high school were posting photos from college campuses, tailgates, study abroad trips to places with cobblestone streets. And here he was in a warehouse outside Austin, wearing a reflective vest, handing over $600 every month to a father who barely looked at him. Or at least that's how it felt. What Ethan didn't see, what he couldn't see, was what was happening on the other side of that bedroom door. Every month, after Robert opened that envelope, he walked to his desk, opened his laptop, and transferred the money. Not to his checking account. Not to his bills. To a separate savings account he had opened specifically for this purpose, at a different bank, with a debit card he never used and a login he kept written in the back of a notebook nobody ever looked at. He labeled the account simply. He never told anyone about it. Not his sister in San Antonio, not his coworker Dennis who he ate lunch with every day, not his neighbor Carol who had known the family for 15 years. This was between him and whatever version of the future he was quietly building for his son, a future Ethan didn't know he was being handed, one envelope at a time. Robert wasn't a complicated man, but he was a deliberate one. And the deliberateness with which he kept that secret said everything about who he was. A man who believed that the most important things you do for the people you love are often the things they never see you doing. Meanwhile, Ethan was changing. Slowly. in the way that real change happens, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small, unglamorous realizations. The first one came about 8 months in. He had worked a double shift on a Saturday, 14 hours on his feet, no real break, the kind of day that strips away pretense and leaves you with nothing but the basic facts of your life. He drove home exhausted, parked in the driveway, and sat in the car for a few minutes just staring at the garage door. And somewhere in that exhaustion, a thought surfaced that he hadn't invited and didn't entirely welcome. He thought about his father. Not with warmth, not yet, but with something approaching curiosity. He thought about Robert, 23 years old, walking into a warehouse job because it was what was available, and staying there for 30 years. He thought about what that must have felt like. The repetition of it. The weight of it. Getting up every single morning and driving to the same building and doing work that nobody outside those walls would ever think about or celebrate. And doing it anyway. Quietly. Without complaint. Ethan sat in his car for a long time that night. He didn't go inside and hug his father. He didn't suddenly become a different person. But something small shifted, the way a door shifts when the house settles. Not open, not yet. But no longer quite as firmly shut. The second realization came a few months later. One of Ethan's coworkers, a guy named Darnell, 26, sharp and funny and one of those people who seems to know something you don't, started talking to Ethan during their lunch breaks about money. Not in a preachy way. Just in the way people talk when they're genuinely interested in something. Darnell had been reading about investing. He was putting $150 a month into an index fund. He talked about compound interest the way some people talk about a religion they recently discovered, with that particular mix of excitement and urgency. Ethan listened. And then he went home and looked it up himself. He spent 3 nights reading. Just reading. Articles, videos, basic explanations of how money grows when you leave it alone and let time do the work. And something about it, the simplicity of it, the almost offensive straightforwardness of it, got under his skin. He kept thinking, why doesn't anybody teach this? Why did I sit in 12 years of school and nobody once sat me down and explained this? He started looking at his own paycheck differently. He was making about $2,200 a month by then. After the $600 to his father, he had $1,600 left. He had been spending most of it, food, clothes, his phone bill, gas, the occasional night out. He hadn't been saving anything beyond what life required. But now, looking at those numbers through the lens of what Darnell had told him, what he'd spent 3 nights reading about, he started to feel something uncomfortable. He started to feel like he was wasting time. Not in the dramatic crisis of identity kind of way. Just in the quiet, factual way that hits you when you look at a spreadsheet and realize the math doesn't lie. Every month he wasn't saving was a month he was trading future security for present comfort. Every dollar he spent on something forgettable was a dollar that would never grow into something more. He didn't transform overnight. But he started. He opened a savings account. Put $300 in it the first month. It wasn't much. But he looked at that balance the way you look at something you built with your own hands, with a kind of private satisfaction that didn't need an audience. Through all of this, he and Robert still weren't close. Still mostly quiet ships passing in the kitchen. But there was a shift, almost invisible, barely measurable, in the atmosphere of the house. Less tension. Less performance. Less of Ethan making sure his body language communicated exactly how wronged he felt. And Robert noticed. He noticed the way fathers notice things, without saying anything about it, without making it a moment, just filing it away in that internal record he kept of who his son was becoming. Then, when Ethan was 20, Robert did something unexpected. He knocked on Ethan's bedroom door one evening and asked if he wanted to go get dinner. Just them. Nothing special, just the barbecue place 2 miles away where they used to go when Ethan was a kid, before high school made everything complicated. Ethan almost said no. He's not entirely sure why he said yes. But he did. They sat across from each other in a booth with red vinyl seats and paper-covered trays, and for the first hour, they talked about nothing. The food, the weather, a story on the news. Safe things. Neutral things. And then Robert said, without looking up from his tray, "I hear you've been saving money." Ethan looked at him. "How do you know that?" Robert almost smiled. You're not spending it. I notice things. There was a silence. Not the cold silence of the past 2 years. Something warmer, more tentative. The silence of two people who are standing at a door, neither one quite sure who should open it first. Ethan said, "Why did you really make me pay rent, Dad?" And Robert put down his food, folded his hands on the table, and looked at his son the way a man looks at someone he's been waiting to have this conversation with for a long time. He said, "I'll tell you. But not yet. When the time is right, I'll tell you everything." Ethan wanted to push. He wanted to demand an answer right there in the booth with the paper trays between them. But something in his father's face stopped him. Not stubbornness. Something else. Something that looked, if he was honest, a little bit like love held in careful custody, waiting for the right moment to be released. They drove home that night without much more being said. But when Ethan got out of the car, he said, "Thanks for dinner, Dad." And Robert said, "Anytime, son." 2 words. But they landed like something that had been missing for a long time finally clicking back into place. There is a moment in every young person's life when they stop performing adulthood and actually start living it. For Ethan, that moment didn't arrive with their announcement. There was no single morning where he woke up and decided to become someone different. It happened the way most real things happen. Gradually, then all at once, built from 1,000 small choices that individually seemed insignificant but collectively were building something solid underneath his feet. He was 21 now. The job at the shipping company had evolved. He wasn't just loading trucks anymore. His supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia who had been in logistics for 20 years, had noticed something in Ethan that Ethan hadn't fully noticed in himself yet, an attention to detail, a reliability, a quiet consistency that made him someone you could count on. She moved him to inventory coordination. A small promotion. Not life-changing money, but meaningful. He was now making closer to $2,700 a month, and the work required him to think, to problem solve, to care about outcomes beyond just finishing the shift. He liked it more than he expected to. And the saving had become serious now. Not the tentative $300 he'd put away that first month, studying his bank balance like it was something fragile. He had a system. Every payday, before he touched a single dollar for anything else, he moved money into savings. $400. Then $5. He treated it like a bill, non-negotiable, first priority, not available for debate. Darnell had shown him how to set up automatic transfers, so the decision was already made before temptation could get involved. He started a small investment account too, just an index fund, just a little bit every month, because the math he'd read about that night still lived in the back of his mind like a quiet insistence. He was building something. He could feel it. But life, as it tends to do, complicated things. About 6 months into this new rhythm, Ethan's car broke down. Not a small problem. The transmission, which the mechanic delivered with the kind of grave expression that tells you before the number does that it's going to be bad. $3,200. More than Ethan had readily available without gutting his savings. He sat in the mechanic's parking lot and stared at his phone for a long time, doing math in his head that kept coming up short. He thought about asking Robert. He sat with that thought uncomfortably, turned it over, examined it from every angle. He had his pride. He had 20 months of quietly proving to himself and to his father that he didn't need saving. Asking for money felt like handing something back. Some piece of the independence he'd been constructing, brick by brick, in the years since that envelope first slid under his father's door. But he also thought about what he'd been learning. About smart decisions versus proud ones. About the difference between stubbornness and wisdom. About how the people who build real financial stability aren't the ones who never ask for help. They're the ones who know when asking is the right move and when it isn't. He called Robert. Not to ask for money, as it turned out, but to ask for advice. "What would you do?" he said. Robert was quiet for a moment, then said, "Come home, let's look at the numbers together." They sat at the kitchen table that night, the same table where Robert had slid that piece of paper across 3 years ago, and they spread out Ethan's finances. Bank statements. His savings balance. His investment account. His monthly expenses. Robert looked at everything carefully, asked a few questions, and then said something that surprised Ethan. He said, "You've done really well." Not as a consolation. not as a pivot to advice, just as a plain, direct statement of fact. And Ethan, who had spent 3 years building this quietly and alone, without acknowledgement, without applause, felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been holding tight. They worked out a plan. Ethan would use a portion of his savings for the repair, rebuild the account over the next 3 months, and in the meantime, Robert would let him use the old pickup truck sitting in the garage. A truck Robert never drove anymore but had never gotten around to selling. It was a practical solution. Simple. And the ease of it, the fact that Robert offered the truck without being asked and without making it a lesson, felt like something new between them. Less teacher and student. More like two adults solving a problem together. That night, after they'd cleaned up the papers and Robert had made coffee and they were sitting in the living room with the TV on low, Ethan asked a question he'd been carrying for a while. He said, "Do you ever regret not doing something else? Besides the warehouse?" Robert thought about it. Really thought about it. Ethan could see him actually considering the question rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. He said, "There were things I could have done differently. Choices I made when I was young that I made out of fear instead of faith. I took the sure thing because I was scared of what happened if the risk didn't work out." He paused. "But I don't sit in regret about it. Regret is expensive. It costs you the present while you're paying for the past." Ethan looked at him. "That's the most philosophical thing you've ever said." Robert smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation." They both laughed. And it was easy. Natural. The laugh of two people who have found their way back to each other after a long detour. Something had healed. Not completely, wounds that deep don't close in a single evening. But the scar tissue was forming. The structure was holding. In the months that followed, they talked more. Not about profound things all the time. Sometimes just about work, about the neighborhood, about whatever game was on. But the channel was open now. The wall Ethan had built was still visible in places, but he'd stopped maintaining it, and without maintenance, walls don't hold. Robert started sharing things too. Small financial wisdoms, not as lectures but as conversation. He told Ethan about a mistake he'd made at 30, a bad loan he'd co-signed for someone who didn't pay it back, how it had cost him 2 years of financial recovery. He told him about how he'd learned to invest, late, in his 40s, and how even starting late had made a difference. He talked about the warehouse, about the people who had come and gone, the ones who'd built something beyond the job and the ones who hadn't, and what he observed made the difference. Ethan listened differently now. Not as a son being lectured. As a person genuinely interested in the hard-earned experience of someone who'd been in the world longer. And then, on a Sunday afternoon in March, when Ethan was a few months away from turning 23, Robert said, "I need to tell you something. About the money." Ethan looked up from his phone. Robert sat down across from him, folded his hands on the table in that way he had, and said, "Every dollar you gave me for rent, I never spent it." The room went very quiet. Ethan stared at his father. "What?" "I put it in a savings account. Every month, from the first envelope you slid under my door, every single dollar. I never touched it." He let that settle for a moment. "You have $14,000 sitting in an account. It's yours. It was always yours." Ethan opened his mouth and closed it again. He felt something rushing through him, not quite any single emotion but a flood of several at once. Shock first. Then something that started as anger and quickly, confusingly, converted into something else. Something that burned behind his eyes and tightened his throat. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because if you'd known, it wouldn't have worked." "What wouldn't have worked?" Robert looked at him steadily. "You needed to believe you were paying real consequences. Real weight. If you knew I was saving it, you would have relaxed. You wouldn't have taken the job seriously, wouldn't have started saving yourself, wouldn't have sat down with Darnell and read about investing at night. The discomfort was the point, Ethan. I needed you uncomfortable long enough to discover what you were capable of." Ethan sat with that. Turned it over. Felt the architecture of the last 3 years rearrange itself in his understanding, every resentful morning, every envelope slid under the door, every night he'd told himself his father was cold and unreasonable, all of it recontextualizing into something completely different. Something that looked, from this new angle, like the most sustained and deliberate act of love he had ever been the recipient of. His eyes were wet. He didn't look away. Robert said, "But I'm not giving it to you yet." Ethan blinked. "What?" "I'll match it. Whatever you save yourself, dollar for dollar. When you bring me 15,000 that you earned and saved on your own, I'll give you the 14,000 plus everything it's grown into. But I'm not handing it over until you've built the habit deep enough that you'll know what to do with it." Ethan stared at his father for a long, long moment. And then he said, with something that was half frustration and half the beginning of a smile, "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met in my life." Robert nodded calmly. "I know. It's a gift. There is a difference between wanting something and being ready for it." Ethan had wanted financial freedom since the night he sat in his car in the driveway, too tired to move, thinking about his father's 30 years in a warehouse. But wanting it and being ready for it, truly ready, structurally ready, ready in the way that means you won't unravel the moment life gets complicated, that took longer. And Robert, with the quiet precision of a man who had spent decades watching what happened to people who got things before they were ready, understood that difference better than Ethan did. So Ethan got to work. Not with the frantic, desperate energy of someone trying to prove a point, though there was a little of that at first, if he's honest. But with something steadier. Something that settled into his daily life the way a good habit does when you've stopped fighting it and started trusting it. He sat down and wrote out a plan. Not on an app, not on a spreadsheet template he downloaded from the internet, just on a yellow legal pad at the kitchen table, the same table where so much of this story had already happened. He wrote down his income. He wrote down every expense. He drew a line through the ones that weren't necessary and circled the ones that were. And then he looked at what was left and asked himself the same question every single month. What is the most useful thing I can do with this? The answer, almost always, was save it. He cut things that surprised him. Not dramatically, he wasn't living lavishly to begin with. But there were subscriptions he'd forgotten about, habits that cost more than he realized, small daily decisions that individually seemed harmless but collectively were a slow leak in his financial foundation. He fixed the leak. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently. Month after month, the number in his savings account grew. He also grew at work. Patricia had continued to invest in him, giving him more responsibility, putting him in rooms where decisions were made, letting him lead small projects. By the time Ethan was 22, he had been promoted twice. He was now a logistics coordinator, managing a small team, earning close to $3,400 a month. It wasn't wealth by any conventional measure. But for a 22-year-old in Austin without a college degree, it was real. It was built. It was his. He and Robert had found a rhythm by now that neither of them could have imagined 3 years earlier. Sunday dinners had become a regular thing. Nothing formal, just Robert cooking something simple, Ethan showing up, the two of them sitting across from each other and talking the way people talk when they've stopped pretending and started actually communicating. They talked about money often, but not always. Sometimes they talked about Robert's childhood, stories Ethan had never heard, the lean years, the specific texture of growing up without enough, the lessons that got written into Robert's bones so early he sometimes forgot they were lessons and not just facts of life. Ethan recorded some of those conversations on his phone. Not for any particular reason he could articulate, just because something told him these were words worth keeping. And he saved. Month after month, through a transmission repair and a medical bill that came out of nowhere and a period of 3 weeks when his hours got cut and the math got tighter than he liked, he saved. He adjusted. He problem-solved. He did exactly what his father had always believed he was capable of doing, back when Ethan didn't believe it about himself yet. 2 years and 9 months after Robert had told him about the matching promise, Ethan sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop and pulled up his savings account. $15,240. He stared at that number for a long time. Then he closed the laptop, walked down the hallway, and knocked on his father's bedroom door. Robert opened it in his reading glasses, a book in his hand, the particular unhurried look of a man spending a quiet evening exactly as he intended. Ethan said, "I'm ready." Robert looked at him for a moment. Then he took off his glasses, set the book on the dresser, and said, "Show me." They sat at the table. Of course they sat at the table. That table had held so much of their story by now it practically had its own character, and Ethan opened his laptop and showed Robert everything. The savings account. The investment account, which had grown more than Ethan expected because time and consistency had done what the math promised they would. His monthly budget. His income. His plan. Robert looked at it all carefully. He asked questions, not testing questions, genuine ones. He nodded at things that impressed him, pointed out one or two things Ethan might consider adjusting. And then he sat back in his chair and looked at his son with an expression Ethan had never quite seen on his face before. It was pride. Pure, uncomplicated, unhurried pride. Not the performed kind that parents sometimes do for an audience. The real kind, the kind that sits quietly in a man's chest and shows up in his eyes when he thinks no one's paying close attention. He said, "Give me a week." A week later, Robert came to Ethan with a number. It was not $14,000. It was $19,400. Ethan looked at the figure on the paper. Then at his father. "You said 14. I said I'd give you what you contributed plus what it grew into. I invested most of it, Ethan. Conservative funds, nothing risky. But I put it to work because money sitting still is money shrinking. It's been almost 5 years. $14,000 invested carefully, with consistent contributions, it grows." Ethan looked back at the paper. $19,400. Plus his $15,200. Total, $34,600. He was 23 years old, working a warehouse logistics job in Austin, Texas, with no college degree, and he had $34,000. He cried. He's not ashamed of that. He sat at the kitchen table where he had slid envelopes under a door with resentment, where he had stared at a piece of paper with 3 numbers on it and felt betrayed, where he had laughed with his father for the first time in years over barbecue and bad television, and he put his face in his hands and he cried. Robert didn't say anything for a little while. He just sat there, the way steady people sit when someone they love is feeling something important. Present. Quiet. Not trying to fix it or hurry it along. Then he put his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Just that. A hand on a shoulder. But it carried everything. Every envelope, every silent morning, every barbecue dinner, every Sunday conversation, every year of deliberate love disguised as discipline. After a while, Ethan looked up and said, "Why didn't you just give it to me at the beginning? Why the whole matching thing? You could have just handed me the money when I was 23 and told me what you'd done." Robert considered this for a moment. Then he said, "Because 23-year-old you needed to know something that 23-year-old me didn't know. He needed to know that he could build something. That the ability was already in him. If I'd handed you $34,000 without the journey, you would have had the money but not the knowledge of what you're capable of. And the money would have been gone in 3 years. But the knowledge, that stays. That compounds. That's the investment that never loses value." Ethan thought about that for a long time. Then he asked his father to help him find a real estate agent. 6 weeks later, Ethan signed the papers on a small condo on the east side of Austin. Nothing large, nothing fancy, a 1-bedroom with good bones and a parking spot and a view of the city lights if you stood on the right side of the kitchen and looked out at just the right angle. He was 23 years old. He owned something. Not perfectly, not without a mortgage, not without the ongoing work of maintenance and bills and responsibility, but his. Built from discipline and time and a father who loved him enough to make him uncomfortable for years. He called Robert from the parking lot after signing. Robert picked up on the second ring. Ethan said, "I got the keys." Robert said, "I know. How does it feel?" Ethan looked up at the building. Thought about the warehouse on a Tuesday. Thought about a yellow legal pad and a savings account and Sunday dinners and a hand on his shoulder. Thought about a piece of paper with 3 numbers on it sliding across a kitchen table, 250, 250, 100, and how much he had hated it, and how completely it had changed his life. He said, "It feels like something I actually earned." And Robert, on the other end of the line, in the house on the east side where all of this had started, smiled the smile of a man who has been waiting 5 years to hear exactly those words. He said, "That's the only way it's supposed to feel. And that is the real story. Not of a father who charged his son rent. Not of a son who resented it. Those are just the surface details, the visible part of something that runs much deeper. The real story is about what love looks like when it refuses to be comfortable. When it decides that giving a person ease right now is less important than giving them capability for a lifetime. When it holds a boundary not out of coldness but out of profound, long-horizon belief in who someone can become. Robert never had a financial advisor. He never took a course. He learned by living, by watching what happened to people who skipped the hard part, who were handed things before they understood them, who had the destination without the journey and therefore couldn't navigate when the road changed. He took everything he learned and he gave it to his son the only way that actually works. Not as information, as experience. Because here is what the banks won't tell you, what the social media finance accounts rarely say clearly enough. Money is not primarily a math problem. It's a behavior problem. The formulas are simple. Spend less than you earn. Save consistently. Invest the difference. Let time work. These are not secrets. Anyone can read them in an afternoon. The hard part is doing them, month after month. When the car breaks down and the hours get cut and your friends are spending freely and the sacrifice feels invisible and the reward feels impossibly far away. The hard part is the doing, and the doing comes from something that cannot be deposited into an account or handed over at a kitchen table. It comes from discipline, built slowly, forged in discomfort. Owned completely because you earned it and not because someone gave it to you. That was Robert's real gift to his son. Not $19,400. Not the matched savings or the invested returns or the down payment on a condo. The gift was the 5 years. The envelopes. The silence and the Sunday dinners and the hand on the shoulder and the long patient faith of a man who looked at his 18-year-old son, directionless, resentful, scrolling his phone at noon, and saw, clearly and without doubt, exactly who he was going to become. Robert saw Ethan before Ethan could see himself, and he built the conditions for that person to appear. If there is a lesson in this story, and there always is in the stories that are worth telling, it is this. The most valuable things your parents give you are rarely the things you can hold in your hands. They are the standards they hold you to when holding you to them is hard. The faith they keep in you when you have none in yourself. The long game they play while you're angry about the short one. And sometimes, the rent they charge you is not about the rent at all. It never was. Ethan knows that now. He knew at the moment he stood in a parking lot with a set of keys in his hand and called his father and heard 2 words travel across the line from a quiet house on the east side of Austin, words that carried more weight than any dollar amount ever could. I know. Because a father who truly knows, who has always known, who never stopped knowing, is worth more than any inheritance. That is the story of Robert and Ethan. And somewhere in it, if you look carefully enough, is your story too.